Good evening, and welcome back to the archive. The great oak doors have been sealed for the night, their brass handles cold to the touch, and the vast corridors stretch before us in comfortable silence. The only sounds now are the gentle settling of ancient timber and the whisper of my footsteps across worn marble floors. This is how I prefer it, when the curious crowds have departed, when the scholars have returned their volumes to the stacks, when it is just you and I, alone with the weight of history. Tonight, I have retrieved something particularly unsettling from the deeper vaults, a collection bound in midnight blue leather, its spine cracked with age. The brass clasps still hold firm, though they bear the green patina of decades. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings rest beside handwritten testimonies, faded photographs beside coroner's reports. This folio documents one of America's strangest and most tragic manias, a collective madness that gripped the quiet villages of New England like frost claiming a late autumn garden. The file bears a simple label, written in my predecessor's careful script: The Great Vampire Panic, 1784 to 1892. Before we break the seal on these documents, if you find comfort in these quiet explorations of humanity's darker impulses, I invite you to subscribe to our archive. It ensures you'll receive word when new exhibits are brought up from storage for our private viewings. The notification bell, if you will, acts as our gentle summons. And let us begin. Fear, you see, is perhaps the most contagious of all human afflictions. It spreads faster than plague, jumps from mind to mind like sparks between dry kindling. And in the late 18th and 19th centuries, across the rocky hills and shadowed valleys of New England, a very particular kind of fear took root. Not fear of the living, though God knows there was enough to worry about in those harsh times, but fear of the dead. The dead, according to whispered testimonies I have here before me, were not resting quietly in their pine coffins. They were rising, they were walking, and they were feeding on their own families. This is the story of America's last great vampire panic, a time when rational farmers and God-fearing townspeople took up shovels in moonlit graveyards, when families turned against their own departed loved ones, when the sound of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis, became synonymous with the supernatural thirst of the undead. It seems impossible now, doesn't it, that such beliefs could flourish in the land of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, in the nation that prided itself on Enlightenment values and rational thought. Yet here in my hands are the testimonies, the newspaper accounts, the carefully documented evidence of an entire region gripped by a mania so complete, so thoroughly believed, that it would persist for over a century. Case File 1, The Grand Delusion, the White Death's Dark Logic. Let me show you first this daguerreotype, its silver surface now clouded with age. It shows a New England family father, mother, 3 children posed stiffly before their white clapboard home. The photograph was taken in 1847 in Vermont. Within 2 years, I can tell you from the accompanying documents, 4 of the 5 people in this image would be dead. This was the reality that gave birth to our delusion. Tuberculosis, known then simply as consumption or the White Death, was stalking the countryside with methodical precision. But what made this disease particularly terrifying to our ancestors was not just its lethality, though it killed 1 in 4 Americans during the 19th century, but its seemingly supernatural behavior. Consumption, you see, did not strike like cholera or smallpox, arriving with dramatic suddenness and departing just as quickly. No, tuberculosis was a patient predator. It would slip into a household like fog through cracks, settling first on one family member, then another, then another. The afflicted would waste away slowly, month by agonizing month, growing pale and thin, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that family members would later burn in fearful ritual. Here is a letter, dated 1854, from one Ezra Johnson of Exeter, Rhode Island, to his brother in Boston. The disease has taken hold of Mary. just as it took our father, and before him, our sister Ruth. She grows thin as winter kindling, and her cough echoes through the house at night, like the very voice of death himself. The physician can offer no explanation save that it runs in families, but we fear something darker is at work. It runs in families. How those 4 words must have echoed in farmhouse kitchens across New England, whispered by candlelight as another child took to bed with the telltale cough. Medical understanding was primitive. The bacterial cause of tuberculosis would not be discovered until 1882, and effective treatment remained decades away. All that afflicted families could observe was the pattern. One family member would die of consumption, and then, often within months, another would begin to show the same symptoms. The first case in our archive that clearly shows the supernatural interpretation comes from 1784 in Vermont. The Tillinghast family had lost 14 members to consumption over a period of several years. The patriarch, Stuckley Tillinghast, was reportedly visited in a dream by his deceased daughter, who warned him that she and other dead family members were returning to claim the living. The townspeople, faced with a medical mystery they could not solve, turned to older explanations, the kind that had sustained their European ancestors through centuries of plague and pestilence. If consumption ran in families, if the dead seemed to call the living to join them, then perhaps the dead were indeed calling. Perhaps they were feeding. The logic, viewed through the lens of their limited understanding, was almost unassailable. The deceased family member, let us call him John, had wasted away over months, growing pale and thin, his life force seemingly draining away, drop by drop. After his death, his wife Mary begins to show the same symptoms. She grows pale, grows weak, begins the same terrible coughing. At night, she speaks to John in her delirium, sometimes calling out to him as if he were present in the room. To a modern mind, we recognize the bacterial transmission, the genetic predisposition, the shared living conditions that made tuberculosis spread so efficiently through households. But to our ancestors, lacking this knowledge, the pattern suggested something far more sinister. John was returning from the grave to drain Mary's life force, just as something had drained his. And so the belief spread from household to household, village to village, like the very disease it sought to explain. By the early 1800s, across Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, a folk understanding had crystallized. Consumption was not merely a disease, but a supernatural affliction. The dead were feeding on the living, and the only way to stop them was to find their bodies and neutralize them. The symptoms that we now understand as typical of advanced tuberculosis became, in the eyes of our ancestors, evidence of vampiric predation. The pallor, the wasting, the tendency of sufferers to be active and restless at night, while feeling worse during the day, all of this fit perfectly with European folklore about the undead. Even the way tuberculosis seemed to make its victims more beautiful, in an ethereal, otherworldly way, the fever-bright eyes, the translucent skin, aligned with old tales of vampiric allure. Here is an account from Dr. Michael Bell's research, describing a typical belief. The corpse was believed to feed upon the life of its surviving family members, drawing their vital essence to itself, and growing ruddy and healthy while the living grew pale and wasted away. What strikes me most profoundly about this delusion, and I use that word not to mock our ancestors, but to acknowledge the tragic gap between their explanation and reality, is how reasonable it must have seemed to them. They were observing real patterns. Families truly were being devastated by a mysterious wasting disease. Their beloved dead truly did seem to be calling the living to join them. The progression of symptoms truly did suggest that some force was draining the life from their bodies. They simply lacked the scientific framework to understand that this force was Mycobacterium tuberculosis, not Nosferatu. And so, across New England, a grim technology developed, a set of practices and rituals designed to combat the vampire threat. Families would exhume their recently deceased relatives, examining the bodies for signs that they had been feeding liquid blood in the heart, hair and nails that appeared to have grown, bodies that seemed too well preserved for their time in the ground. If such signs were found, and given the natural processes of decomposition, they often were, the family would take action. They would burn the heart, sometimes the entire body. They would rearrange the bones. They would force remaining family members to consume the ashes of the burned organs, believing this would break the supernatural connection between the dead and the dying. This was not the work of ignorant peasants, mind you. These were farmers, merchants, craftsmen people who in every other aspect of their lives displayed perfect rationality. Yet faced with a medical mystery that threatened to destroy their families, they turned to solutions that seemed, to our modern eyes, both heartbreaking and horrifying. The grand delusion had taken hold, and it would persist for over a century, claiming not just the lives lost to tuberculosis, but the dignity of the dead and the sanity of the living. Case File 2. The Tragedy of Mercy Lena Brown Lett. Youths now leave the hall of collective delusion and walk deeper into the archive, where the air grows heavier with individual sorrow. Here, in a climate-controlled case, rests a collection of documents that tells perhaps the most heartbreaking story in our entire vampire panic folio. The papers are brittle, some brown with age, others bearing the watermarks of tears shed over a century ago. This is the file of Mercy Lena Brown, a name that should have been remembered for her youth, her beauty, her brief life of 19 years. Instead, she became the final and most famous victim of New England's vampire delusion. Her story a testament to how fear can drive even loving families to unspeakable acts. The Brown family lived in Exeter, Rhode Island, in a modest farmhouse that still stands today, though it bears no marker of the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. George Brown was a respected farmer, a man known for his steady temperament and devotion to his family. His wife, Mary Eliza, had borne him 4 children: Mary Olive, Mercy Lena, Lena Mercy, and Edwin. In the winter of 1883, the White Death came to call. Here is the first document in Mercy's file, a brief obituary from the Providence Journal, dated December 10, 1883. Died in Exeter, Mary Eliza Brown, beloved wife of George T. Brown, aged 36 years. Mrs. Brown succumbed to consumption after a lingering illness. She leaves behind a devoted husband and 4 children to mourn her loss. Such a simple notice for such a profound beginning. Mary Eliza's death from tuberculosis was sadly unremarkable for the time. What made it significant was what followed, the slow, methodical way the disease began to claim the rest of the family, as if something were indeed calling them to follow their mother into the ground. 6 months after Mary Eliza's death, her eldest daughter, Mary Olive, began to show the telltale signs: the persistent cough, the gradual wasting, the fever that came and went like tide. By 1884, she too was dead, leaving behind only this photograph, a young woman with dark eyes and an ethereal beauty that tuberculosis often lent its victims in their final stages. George Brown buried his wife and daughter in the family plot at Chestnut Hill Cemetery, and for several years it seemed the disease had run its course. His remaining children, Mercy, Lena, and Edwin, appeared healthy. The farm prospered. Life, as it does, continued. But consumption is patient. In 1890, Edwin Brown, now a young man of 24, began to exhibit symptoms. The family physician, Dr. Harold Metcalf, diagnosed consumption and prescribed the standard treatments of the time: fresh air, rest, a nutritious diet when the patient could manage it. Edwin's condition fluctuated. Some days he seemed to improve, others he grew worse. This pattern of recovery and relapse was typical of tuberculosis, but to his family and neighbors it suggested something more sinister. Edwin had always been robust, they whispered. He had worked the farm alongside his father without complaint. What could be draining his strength so systematically, so persistently? And then, in the winter of 1891, 19-year-old Mercy Brown fell ill. I have here her photograph, taken perhaps a year before her death. She gazes directly at the camera with large, solemn eyes, her dark hair pulled back severely, her expression holding that particular melancholy that seems to mark all daguerreotypes of the era. She was considered quite beautiful, with the kind of delicate features that were prized in young women of her time. Mercy's decline was swift and severe. Unlike Edwin, whose condition waxed and waned, she wasted away with frightening speed. By January of 1892, she was bedridden, coughing blood into the white handkerchiefs that her remaining sister, Lena, would wash and dry by the kitchen fire each morning. On January 17, 1892, Mercy Lena Brown died. The Pawtuxet Valley Gleaner reported her death with the same unremarkable brevity that had marked her mother's obituary. Miss Mercy L. Brown, daughter of George T. Brown of Exeter, died on Tuesday last of consumption, aged 19 years. But Mercy's death was far from unremarkable to her family and community. Within weeks of her funeral, Edwin's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He grew paler, weaker, more listless with each passing day, and in his delirium for tuberculosis, often brought fever and hallucinations, he began to speak of Mercy. He spoke of her as if she were present in the room. He called out to her in the night. Sometimes, witnesses reported, he seemed to be pleading with her to leave him alone. This is where our individual tragedy intersects with the collective delusion I described earlier. George Brown was not a superstitious man by nature, but he was a father watching his son die by degrees, just as he had watched his wife and daughter die before him. When neighbors began to whisper that perhaps Mercy was not resting peacefully, that perhaps she was feeding on Edwin's life force, he found himself willing to entertain explanations that would have seemed absurd to him just months earlier. The pressure came from all sides. Here is a letter found among the Brown family papers from one Amos Stafford, a neighbor. George, I know this will sound strange to you, but Sarah and I have been talking, and we believe you should consider what the old-timers say about families that waste away like yours has. My grandfather came from the old country, and he always said that sometimes the dead don't rest, especially when they die young and unwed like your Mercy. Edwin is fading fast, and if there's even a chance. The letter trails off, unfinished, as if Stafford himself could not quite bring himself to complete the thought. But others were more direct. The local folklore was clear. When multiple family members died of consumption in succession, when the living seemed to waste away as if something were draining them, the remedy was to exhume the dead and examine them for signs of vampiric activity. If such signs were found, the heart must be burned and the ashes fed to the afflicted family member to break the supernatural connection. For weeks, George Brown resisted these suggestions. But as Edwin continued to deteriorate, as the young man grew ever more skeletal and pale, as his delirious cries for mercy echoed through the farmhouse night after night, the grieving father's resolve began to crumble. On March 17, 1892, exactly 2 months after Mercy's death, George Brown made the decision that would haunt the Brown family name forever. He would exhume his daughter's body. The exhumation took place on a cold, gray morning, with a small crowd of townspeople gathered in Chestnut Hill Cemetery. Along with George Brown came Dr. Metcalf, the family physician, and several neighbors who had been advocating for this course of action. The local newspaper would later report that nearly 50 people were present, drawn by morbid curiosity and genuine belief in the vampire theory. What they found when they opened Mercy's coffin seemed to confirm their worst fears. Mary Eliza Brown, dead for 9 years, was little more than bones and dust. Mary Olive, deceased for 8 years, was similarly decomposed. But Mercy, buried in the depths of winter in ground that remained frozen for months, was remarkably well preserved. Her skin retained some color, her hair appeared lustrous, and most damning of all, when Dr. Metcalf cut into her heart, liquid blood flowed out. To our modern understanding, these are perfectly normal phenomena. A body buried in winter in frozen ground would naturally decompose more slowly. Liquid blood in the heart of a recently deceased person is not only normal but expected. But to the crowd gathered in that cemetery, these signs confirmed their darkest suspicions. Mercy Brown was a vampire. What happened next represents one of the most tragic miscarriages of folk justice in American history. The gathered townspeople built a fire right there in the cemetery. They cut out Mercy's heart and liver, both of which still contained liquid blood, and burned them on a stone slab while the crowd watched. The organs, they reported, burned with unusual vigor, another sign, they believed, of supernatural influence. But the ritual was not complete. For the cure to work, Edwin would have to consume the ashes of his sister's burned heart. I have here a newspaper account from the Providence Journal, published several days after the exhumation. The heart and liver were removed and burned, and the ashes given to the brother who was suffering from the same disease. Such clinical language for such a horrific act. Edwin Brown, weak and delirious with tuberculosis, was fed the ashes of his sister's heart by his own father, who believed this cannibalistic act would save his son's life. It did not, of course. Edwin Brown died 2 months later, on May 2nd, 1892, carrying to his grave the knowledge that his family had desecrated his beloved sister's remains in a desperate attempt to save him. The consumption that killed him was exactly the same bacterial infection that had killed his mother, his sister Mary Olive, and Mercy herself. No supernatural force was at work, only Mycobacterium tuberculosis, following its inexorable biological imperative. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Mercy Brown's story is not the desecration itself, but what it reveals about the depths of human desperation. George Brown was not a monster. He was a father who had already lost his wife and 2 daughters, who was watching his only son waste away before his eyes, who was willing to try anything, even the unthinkable, if it offered even the smallest chance of saving his last remaining child. The vampire panic gave him a framework for understanding his family's suffering and, more importantly, it gave him something to do about it. In the face of medical helplessness, it offered action. In the face of random tragedy, it offered an explanation. In the face of death's inevitability, it offered hope. That this hope was built on delusion. That this action was both futile and horrific. That this explanation was tragically wrong. None of this diminishes the very human need that drove George Brown to that cemetery on that March morning. It only makes the entire affair more heartbreaking. Mercy Brown's grave today bears a simple headstone. Mercy L. Brown, died January 17th, 1892, aged 19 years. No mention of the vampire panic, no reference to the desecration. Just a young woman's name and dates, as if she had lived and died peacefully in her bed. But her story had legs, as they say. Word of the Exeter exhumation spread throughout New England and beyond. Newspapers as far away as New York picked up the tale, often embellishing it with sensational details. Mercy Brown became, in death, more famous than she had ever been in life, not for her youth or beauty or whatever dreams she might have harbored, but for the horrific end of her brief story. And perhaps most tragically of all, her case inspired others. In the months and years that followed, families across New England who were suffering from tuberculosis began to look at their own deceased relatives with new suspicion. If the Browns had found a vampire in their family plot, if such things were real and active in the world, then perhaps other mysterious deaths could be similarly explained. The personal folly of one desperate father became a template for others, and Mercy Brown's desecrated remains became a beacon that drew other families into the same tragic delusion. Case File 3, The Grim Science of Vampire Detection. Let us move now to a different wing of our archive, where the atmosphere grows even more somber. Here, behind glass cases that reflect the dim gaslight like dark mirrors. We keep the artifacts of misguided ingenuity, the tools, techniques, and methodologies that our ancestors developed to combat threats that existed only in their collective imagination. This section documents what I can only call the technology of vampire detection and destruction, a grim science that developed its own protocols, its own expertise, its own terrible logic. What we see here is humanity's remarkable capacity for systematic thinking applied to a fundamentally flawed premise, creating an elaborate edifice of procedure built upon a foundation of sand. The methods were not random or chaotic. They followed patterns, developed consistency, spread through communities like any other innovation. In essence, New England had developed a folk technology for dealing with the undead, and like all technologies, it claimed its own kind of authority. Let me show you first this leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age and stained with what I prefer not to identify. It belonged to one Ephraim Carpenter, who described himself as something of an expert in these matters. Carpenter lived in Vermont, and according to his own records, participated in no fewer than 7 exhumations between 1810 and 1830. His journal reads like a technical manual. The signs are always consistent in cases of the feeding dead. First, examine the condition of the remains. If the body appears too fresh for its time in the ground, if the hair and nails show signs of growth, if the limbs are pliable rather than rigid, these are sure indicators of unnatural preservation. Carpenter goes on to detail what he calls the crucial test. The heart must be examined above all else. In natural death, the heart empties and dries. In the feeding dead, the heart retains liquid blood, sometimes in great quantity. This blood is the life force stolen from the living, and it must be destroyed by fire if the affliction is to be stopped. This crucial test became the cornerstone of vampire detection throughout New England. It was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of decomposition, the natural processes by which bodies break down after death. In winter burials, particularly in the frozen ground common throughout the region, bodies could remain well preserved for months. Liquid blood in the cardiovascular system was not only normal but expected, especially in cases where the person had died from a disease like tuberculosis that often caused internal bleeding. But our ancestors, lacking knowledge of bacterial decomposition and preservation, interpreted these natural phenomena as supernatural signs. They developed an entire diagnostic framework around observations that were, in fact, perfectly ordinary. Here is another document, a letter from Dr. Josiah Goodhue of Woodstock, Vermont, dated 1854. Dr. Goodhue was one of the few medical professionals of his era who attempted to challenge the vampire beliefs, though his efforts were largely unsuccessful. I have attended 3 such exhumations in the past 2 years, and in each case, the signs that the townspeople interpret as evidence of vampiric activity are nothing more than the natural effects of cold weather preservation and the ordinary retention of bodily fluids after death. Yet when I attempt to explain these phenomena, I am met with suspicion, as if my medical training makes me somehow complicit in concealing the supernatural truth. Dr. Goodhue's frustration is palpable in his correspondence. He was fighting not just ignorance, but a systematic belief system that had developed its own internal logic and its own community of practitioners. The vampire hunters had created what anthropologists now recognize as a complete folk medical system, one with its own diagnostic criteria, treatment protocols, and specialist knowledge. The technology extended beyond mere detection. Once a vampire was identified, specific procedures had to be followed for its destruction. These methods were passed down through communities, refined through practice, and standardized across the region. The most common technique was heart removal and burning, as we saw in Mercy Brown's case. But there were variations and elaborations. Some practitioners insisted that the entire body must be burned. Others believed that dismemberment was sufficient, cutting the body into pieces and rearranging the bones to prevent the spirit from reassembling itself. Here is an account from the Vermont Telegraph, dated 1830, describing an exhumation in Manchester. The body was found in an unusual state of preservation, with liquid blood in the heart cavity. The townspeople removed the heart and burned it on a flat stone, but they also took the precaution of turning the body face down in its coffin and scattering the bones of the hands and feet, believing this would prevent any possibility of the creature's return. The ritualistic aspects of these procedures reveal how deeply the communities had invested in their supernatural explanation. These were not random acts of desecration, but carefully choreographed ceremonies with specific purposes and expected outcomes. The burning almost always took place in or near the cemetery, often on a flat stone that served as an altar. Community members would gather to witness the destruction, and the ashes would be carefully collected for the final phase of the treatment. This final phase, the consumption of the vampire's ashes by the afflicted family member, represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire technology. The belief was that the supernatural connection between the vampire and its victim could only be broken by this act of controlled cannibalism. The living person had to consume the burned remains of their deceased relative, taking the vampire's power into themselves and thereby neutralizing the threat. I have here a recipe, yes, a recipe found among the papers of the Tillinghast family of Rhode Island, describing the proper preparation of vampire ashes. The heart, once burned to complete ash, should be mixed with water or wine to make it palatable. Some add molasses or honey to mask the taste. The patient should consume the entire portion while it is still warm from the fire, and should fast for 6 hours afterward to ensure the medicine takes proper effect. The clinical language is chilling. These people had developed a pharmacology of the supernatural, complete with dosage instructions and administration guidelines. They were approaching the impossible with the methodical precision of the possible. But perhaps most revealing of all is the evidence that this folk technology was evolving, adapting, becoming more sophisticated over time. Later accounts show innovations and refinements that suggest a community of practice, sharing knowledge and improving techniques. By the 1850s, some practitioners had begun using rudimentary medical instruments in their examinations. Here is an inventory from the estate of one Jonas Wheeler, who was known throughout Connecticut as an expert in vampire detection. One leather surgical kit containing bone saw, forceps, and examination knives. One set of brass scales for weighing organs. One collection of glass vials for blood samples. One iron brazier for burning ceremonies. Wheeler had essentially equipped himself as a supernatural pathologist, complete with the tools of his trade. The brass scales suggest he was attempting to quantify his observations, perhaps weighing hearts to determine if they contained more blood than they should. The glass vials indicate he was collecting samples, possibly for comparison or further examination. This represents a fascinating collision between pre-scientific thinking and scientific methodology. Wheeler was applying empirical observation and systematic investigation to a fundamentally superstitious belief. He was trying to bring rigor to the impossible, precision to the imaginary. The technology also developed regional variations, suggesting different communities were experimenting with different approaches. In some areas of Vermont, practitioners began examining not just the heart, but also the liver, believing that vampires stored stolen life force in multiple organs. In parts of Connecticut, the focus shifted to the condition of the fingernails and hair, with elaborate measurements taken to determine if supernatural growth had occurred. Some communities developed what can only be called quality control measures. Multiple examiners would be present to verify findings. Witnesses would sign statements attesting to what they had observed. In a few cases, I have found actual diagrams, crude drawings, showing the position of the body in the coffin, the color and consistency of any blood found, the appearance of preserved organs. Here is one such diagram, sketched by someone with shaking hands on a piece of brown paper. It shows a coffin viewed from above, with careful notations. Hair black, appears longer than at burial. Fingernails grown approximately 1/4 inch. Heart examined by J. Morrison contained 4 ounces liquid blood, dark red color. The attention to detail is remarkable. These people were conducting forensic examinations with the thoroughness of modern crime scene investigators. They were documenting their findings, comparing results, building a database of supernatural evidence. And yet, for all their methodical approach, for all their careful observation and systematic documentation, they were studying a phenomenon that did not exist. Every measurement was meaningless. Every careful notation was recording natural processes they did not understand. Case File 4, the Hindsight File, the true horror hiding in plain sight. We arrive now at the final section of our archive, where the lights burn lowest and the silence feels most profound. Here, in climate-controlled cases that preserve documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we keep the records that reveal the most heartbreaking truth of all. The real monster was there all along, invisible to our ancestors, but perfectly visible to us. This is what I call the hindsight file, the accumulated evidence of what tuberculosis actually was, how it actually spread, and why the patterns that seemed so supernatural to our ancestors were, in fact, the methodical work of one of humanity's oldest and most efficient killers. Let me begin with this photograph, taken in 1882 by a German physician named Robert Koch. It shows, magnified hundreds of times, a collection of rod-shaped bacteria that he had isolated from the sputum of tuberculosis patients. These tiny organisms, which he called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, were the true vampires of New England invisible predators that fed not on blood, but on lung tissue, spreading from person to person through the very air they breathed. Koch's discovery won him the Nobel Prize and revolutionized medicine's understanding of infectious disease. But the photograph before me was taken in 1882, the same year that Edwin Brown first began showing symptoms, 10 years before Mercy Brown's exhumation. The knowledge existed, but like so many scientific advances, it took decades to filter from European laboratories to American farmhouses. The real tragedy of the vampire panic is not that it happened, but when it happened. Our ancestors were burning hearts and feeding ashes to dying children at precisely the moment when medical science was finally beginning to understand what they were actually fighting. Here is a letter from Dr. Edward Trudeau, one of America's pioneering tuberculosis researchers, written to a colleague in 1891, just 1 year before Mercy Brown's death. We now know with certainty that consumption is caused by a specific bacillus that spreads through expectoration and inhalation. The disease follows predictable patterns of infection within households and communities. What our patients and their families interpret as supernatural influence is simply the natural progression of bacterial transmission. Dr. Trudeau was establishing the first American sanatorium for tuberculosis treatment in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, based on the revolutionary understanding that fresh air, rest, and proper nutrition could help patients fight off the infection. His work was saving lives even as families in nearby New England were still digging up their dead. The bacterial explanation makes perfect sense of everything that seemed so mysterious to our ancestors. Tuberculosis spreads most efficiently in the close quarters of family homes, particularly during the long sealed-in winters of New England. One infected family member would cough the bacteria into the shared air, where other family members would inhale it night after night, month after month. The disease has a long incubation period, often 6 months to 2 years, which meant that family members could be infected simultaneously, but show symptoms in sequence, creating the illusion that the dead were somehow calling the living to join them. The bacterial load, the individual's immune response, age, nutrition, and general health all affected how quickly symptoms appeared and how severe they became. This explains the seemingly supernatural timing that so frightened our ancestors. Mary Eliza Brown died in 1883, but she had probably been infected years earlier. and had been spreading the bacteria to her children throughout her illness. Mary Olive showed symptoms 6 months later, not because her mother's ghost was draining her life force, but because she had been breathing the same contaminated air for months or years. Edwin's long period of apparent health, followed by sudden decline, also fits the bacterial pattern perfectly. He may have been infected at the same time as his sisters, but had a stronger immune system that held the disease in check for years. When his resistance finally broke down, perhaps due to stress, poor nutrition, or simple immune exhaustion, the bacteria multiplied rapidly, producing the dramatic wasting that his family interpreted as vampiric attack. Even Mercy's swift decline makes sense in this context. As the youngest, she had been exposed to the highest bacterial load for the longest time, breathing air contaminated by her dying mother and sisters. When her own symptoms finally appeared, the infection was already advanced, leading to the rapid progression that killed her within months. The bacterial explanation also accounts for the symptoms that seemed so eerily aligned with vampire folklore. The pallor and wasting were simply the body's response to chronic infection and poor oxygen exchange in damaged lungs. The restlessness at night was caused by breathing difficulties that worsened when lying flat. The ethereal beauty often noted in tuberculosis victims was the result of weight loss that emphasized bone structure, combined with the fever-bright eyes and translucent skin that accompanied the disease. Even the tendency of tuberculosis patients to be active and talkative in the evening, a symptom that fed beliefs about supernatural nocturnal activity, was simply the natural rhythm of the infection. Fever typically peaked in late afternoon and evening, giving patients temporary energy and alertness before exhaustion set in. But perhaps most damning of all is what we now know about the evidence that convinced families their loved ones had become vampires. Here is a medical text from 1895, just 3 years after Mercy Brown's exhumation, describing the normal process of decomposition. Bodies interred during winter months in cold climates may remain well preserved for extended periods, particularly if buried in frozen ground. The retention of liquid blood in the cardiovascular system is expected for several months after death, especially in cases where the deceased suffered from diseases causing internal hemorrhaging. Every sign that convinced George Brown his daughter was a vampire was, in fact, a normal consequence of winter burial and tuberculosis-related bleeding. The liquid blood in Mercy's heart was not stolen life force, but simply her own blood, retained in the cold ground, exactly as medical science would predict. The hair and nail growth that so impressed witnesses was an optical illusion caused by skin shrinkage during dehydration. The unusual preservation was merely the natural result of cold weather. The organs that burned with supernatural vigor were simply fatty tissues that, like any organic matter, burned readily when exposed to flame. What makes this hindsight so painful is that some medical professionals of the time did understand these processes and tried to intervene. Here is a record from Dr. Metcalf, a physician who attended the Brown family and witnessed Mercy's exhumation. I attempted to explain to Mr. Brown and the assembled townspeople that the condition of the remains was entirely consistent with natural decomposition processes, but my words carried little weight against the settled convictions of the community. I fear that medical education has not yet penetrated to the rural districts where such beliefs persist. Dr. Metcalf knew. He understood that Mercy Brown was not a vampire, that her preserved condition was perfectly normal, that burning her heart would do nothing to save Edwin's life. Yet he stood by and watched the desecration occur, powerless against the collective will of a community that had already decided what the evidence meant. This points to perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire vampire panic. It persisted not because knowledge was unavailable, but because that knowledge was not trusted, not accepted, not integrated into the folk understanding of disease and death that governed rural communities. The bacterial theory of tuberculosis transmission suggested solutions that were both simpler and more difficult than vampire hunting. Simpler because they didn't require grave desecration, and ritual cannibalism. More difficult because they required changes in fundamental lifestyle patterns, better ventilation, isolation of sick family members, improved nutrition, and above all, the willingness to separate from dying loved ones during their final months. Vampire hunting, for all its horror, allowed families to stay together, to care for their sick relatives, to maintain the social bonds that were so crucial to survival in isolated rural communities. The bacterial explanation demanded sacrifice, not of the dead, but of the living, the sacrifice of proximity, intimacy, and the comfort that came from nursing dying family members personally. Here is a heartbreaking letter from a Vermont farmer named Samuel Wheeler, written in 1888 to his brother in Boston. The doctor says we must send Martha to the sanatorium, that her coughing sickness is catching and threatens the other children. But how can we send our daughter away to die among strangers? The old ways may seem harsh, but at least they let us keep our families together. Wheeler's dilemma illustrates the impossible choice facing families caught between old beliefs and new knowledge. The vampire explanation, however gruesome, preserved family unity even in death. The bacterial explanation demanded separations that felt like abandonment. The medical establishment of the late 19th century was also hampered by its own limitations. Even with Koch's discovery, effective treatment remained decades away. Doctors could explain what caused tuberculosis, but they could not cure it. They could recommend sanatorium treatment, but such facilities were expensive and often ineffective. They could advise fresh air and rest, but families struggling with poverty and farm work could rarely afford such luxuries. In this context, vampire hunting began to look less like superstition and more like a desperate alternative to medical helplessness. At least the old ways offered hope for action, for control, for the possibility that something could be done to stop the relentless progression of death through a family. The most chilling document in our hindsight file is a statistical analysis compiled by the Rhode Island Department of Health in 1896, just 4 years after Mercy Brown's death. It shows that tuberculosis mortality in rural areas, where vampire beliefs persisted, was actually higher than in urban areas, where modern medical approaches were more widely accepted. The vampire hunters were not just wrong, they were making the problem worse. The rituals that required family members to gather around exhumed bodies, to handle infected remains, to consume ashes that may have contained active bacteria, all of this increased rather than decreased the risk of transmission. The communities that clung most tightly to supernatural explanations were the ones that suffered most from the very real bacterial threat they were trying to combat. Their folk technology, for all its elaborate ritual and apparent efficacy, was actually counterproductive from a public health standpoint. Yet even this knowledge must be tempered with compassion for our ancestors' predicament. They were facing a genuine medical crisis with inadequate tools and incomplete information. The vampire explanation provided a framework for understanding an otherwise inexplicable tragedy, and the associated rituals provided a sense of agency in the face of apparent helplessness. That the framework was wrong and the rituals were harmful does not diminish the very human needs they were attempting to address. Our ancestors needed to understand why their families were dying, needed to believe that something could be done to stop it, needed to maintain hope in the face of seemingly inevitable loss. The vampire panic gave them all of these things. It was a catastrophically wrong answer to legitimate human needs, but it was an answer when the medical establishment had little to offer beyond sympathy and palliative care. The real tragedy is not that they chose wrong, but that they had to choose at all, that they lived at the precise historical moment, when old explanations were breaking down, but new ones had not yet taken hold, when traditional remedies were being questioned, but effective alternatives were not yet available. They were caught between worlds, between ways of understanding, between the dying light of folk wisdom and the dawning light of scientific medicine. In that twilight space, monsters seemed not only possible but probable, and the most desperate measures seemed not only justified but necessary. The bacteria that killed Mercy Brown are still with us today, though we have largely tamed them with antibiotics and public health measures. The fear that drove her family to desecrate her remains is still with us too, manifesting whenever modern medicine reaches the limits of its knowledge and people are forced to choose between the certainty of doing nothing and the uncertainty of trying anything. The real horror hiding in plain sight was not supernatural vampires feeding on family bonds, but natural bacteria exploiting exactly those same bonds. The love that held families together was the very mechanism by which the disease spread. The intimacy that made them human was also what made them vulnerable. In the end, our ancestors were fighting the right war against the wrong enemy, using weapons that could only harm themselves. In a battle, they were doomed to lose, not because they lacked courage or determination, but because they were aiming at shadows, while the real threat moved freely among them, invisible and unstoppable, carried on every breath and every tender kiss. Reflection. And so we close the folio on America's vampire panic, these brittle pages documenting one of humanity's most elaborate and tragic misunderstandings. The brass clasps feel cold beneath my fingers as I secure the binding, sealing away once more these testimonies to our ancestors' capacity for both love and delusion. As I return these documents to their climate-controlled case, I find myself contemplating the strange comfort they might offer us in our own troubled times. For we, too, live in an age of invisible threats viruses that spread through the very air we share, environmental changes that work their slow damage beyond the reach of our senses, social forces that seem to drain the life from our communities in ways we struggle to understand. We, too, find ourselves grasping for explanations when the world grows dark around us, seeking someone or something to blame when the people we love begin to waste away before our eyes. We, too, develop elaborate technologies to combat threats that may exist more in our collective imagination than in the physical world. The vampire hunters of New England were not fools or primitives. They were people much like ourselves, rational in most spheres of their lives, loving toward their families, desperate to protect what they held most dear. When faced with a medical mystery that threatened to destroy everything they cared about, they did what humans have always done. They created a story that made sense of senseless suffering, and they acted on that story with all the courage and determination they could muster. That their story was wrong, that their actions were harmful, that their courage was misdirected, none of this makes them less human, less worthy of our compassion, less similar to ourselves than we might prefer to believe. In fact, what strikes me most forcefully about this entire episode is how completely reasonable it must have seemed to them at the time. The patterns they observed were real. Families truly were being devastated by a mysterious wasting disease. The symptoms they interpreted as supernatural truly did align with centuries of folklore about the undead. The evidence they found in exhumed bodies truly did seem to confirm their darkest suspicions. They were wrong not because they were stupid or superstitious, but because they were human creatures who must create meaning from incomplete information, who must act in the face of uncertainty, who must find hope even in the darkest circumstances. The bacteria that actually killed their families were invisible to them, incomprehensible without microscopes and medical training they did not possess. The vampires they imagined were visible, comprehensible, defeatable through methods that lay within their power to employ. Given the choice between an explanation that left them helpless and one that offered the possibility of action, they chose action. Who among us would have chosen differently? This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson the vampire panic offers. That collective delusion is not the province of the ignorant or the backwards, but a trap that can ensnare any community when fear combines with love, when desperation meets incomplete knowledge, when the need to do something, anything, overwhelms the wisdom of accepting that sometimes there is nothing to be done. The technologies our ancestors developed for fighting vampires were elaborate, consistent, and utterly convincing to those who employed them. They had their own experts, their own diagnostic criteria, their own apparent successes. They had peer review in the form of community witnesses, quality control in the form of multiple examiners, and documentation that met the standards of their time. What they lacked was not rigor or method or systematic thinking, but the foundational knowledge that would have revealed their entire enterprise to be built on sand. They brought impressive intellectual machinery to bear on a fundamentally flawed premise, creating an elaborate edifice of procedure and protocol that was both logically consistent and completely wrong. This, too, should give us pause in our own age of expertise and authority. How much of what we take to be settled knowledge might future generations view with the same mix of compassion and horror with which we regard the vampire hunters? How many of our own elaborate technologies might prove to be sophisticated responses to problems that exist primarily in our collective imagination? I do not ask these questions to promote relativism or to suggest that all beliefs are equally valid. Robert Koch's bacteria were real in a way that New England vampires were not. Scientific medicine saves lives in ways that heartburning never could. The difference between knowledge and delusion, between effective action and harmful ritual, remains both real and crucial. But the vampire panic reminds us that this difference is not always obvious to those living through it, that intelligent and well-meaning people can be catastrophically wrong, that the consensus of a community, even a community of apparent experts, is not always a reliable guide to truth. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that behind every collective delusion lies a collection of individual tragedies, that the people caught up in mass hysteria are not abstract figures in a historical narrative, but human beings struggling with grief, fear, and loss much like our own. George Brown was not a monster for exhuming his daughter's body and feeding her ashes to his dying son. He was a father who had already lost too much and could not bear to lose more, who was offered an explanation that seemed to make sense and a solution that seemed to offer hope. That the explanation was wrong and the solution was horrific does not make his desperation any less understandable or his love any less real. Mercy Brown was not a vampire, but she was a victim not of supernatural predation, but of the gap between human need and human knowledge, between the stories we tell ourselves and the reality we inhabit, between the desire to protect our loved ones and our ability to understand what actually threatens them. Her brief life and tragic afterlife serve as a reminder that our ancestors were not different from us in any fundamental way. They felt the same love, feared the same losses, grasped for the same comfort and control that we seek in our own dark times. They were wrong about vampires, but they were right about the preciousness of family, the horror of watching loved ones waste away, the desperate need to believe that something can be done when everything seems hopeless. Their folly was human folly. Their panic was human panic. Their mistakes were human mistakes. And in recognizing this, perhaps we can find both humility about our own certainties and compassion for all those who have struggled, as we still struggle, to make sense of a world that often seems determined to break our hearts. The archive holds many such stories tales of good people making terrible choices, of love leading to harm, of the very qualities that make us human becoming the source of our greatest errors. These documents serve not as indictments of the past, but as mirrors for the present, reminders that we are all just a few wrong turns away from our own elaborate delusions, our own well-intentioned disasters. For now, though, leave these worries here in the archive, filed away among the other specimens of human folly. The great doors will seal behind you, the silence will return, and these ghosts of New England's past will rest quietly in their climate-controlled cases until someone else comes seeking to understand how good people can go so terribly wrong. Take with you not judgment, but compassion, not superiority, but humility, not the comfort of distance, but the recognition of kinship with all those who have loved deeply enough to act foolishly, who have feared greatly enough to believe impossible things, who have hoped desperately enough to try anything, even the unthinkable, to save what they hold most dear. Sleep well, knowing that the real vampires have been conquered by knowledge, that the invisible bacteria have been tamed by medicine, that the mysterious wasting has been explained by science. But sleep humbly too, remembering that our ancestors slept with equal confidence in their own understanding, their own technologies, their own ability to protect those they loved from the darkness that seemed to be closing in around them. The archive keeps all our stories, the wise and the foolish, the beautiful and the terrible, the triumphs and the tragedies. They are all part of the same human story, all threads in the same complex tapestry of hope and fear, love and loss, knowledge and ignorance that defines our species. Rest now, and let the dead, both the real and the imagined, lie in peace.